It was just another humid summer night in Queens, New York when my sister, Hannah, called me, her voice laced with panic. I was already half asleep in my apartment in Astoria, but the moment I heard the fear in her voice, I was wide awake. "Sam, I need you to stay on the phone with me," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting up in bed. I could hear her breathing heavily, like she was trying to keep it together. "There's someone outside my door. He says he's a cop." I felt my stomach drop. Hannah lived alone in a small ground-floor apartment in Sunnyside, just a few subway stops away. The neighborhood was generally safe, but like any big city, strange things happened. "What do you mean, someone says he's a cop?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm for her sake. "He knocked on my door a few minutes ago," she said, her voice trembling. "Said he was with the NYPD and needed to speak to me about a reported break-in nearby. But, Sam, something doesn't feel right." I could hear the faint sound of someone knocking again in the background, this time louder, more insistent. "Ma'am, open up, NYPD." A gruff voice called from the other side of her door. Hannah's phone was on speaker, and I could hear every word. "Don't open it," I said quickly, my heart racing. "Hannah, whatever you do, keep that door locked." I jumped out of bed, throwing on a pair of jeans and grabbing my keys. I knew I had to get to her place, but traffic in Queens at night was unpredictable, and I didn't know if I'd get there in time. "Call 911, Hannah. Make sure it's really them." "I already did," she whispered, her voice shaky. "They said they didn't send anyone out here." The knocking grew louder, almost desperate now. I could hear the man outside her door getting frustrated. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. Open the door now or we're coming in." I ran down the stairs of my apartment building, fumbling with my phone to call an Uber. The streets were damp from a light drizzle that had passed earlier, leaving the air thick and sticky. The summer heat clung to everything, making it hard to breathe as I jogged to the nearest corner to wait for my ride. "Stay with me, Hannah," I said into the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just keep talking, okay?" "I'm so scared, Sam," she whispered. "What if he tries to break in?" "Don't worry," I lied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Just keep the chain lock on. I'm on my way." I could hear the man outside the door muttering something under his breath, followed by a series of heavy bangs that sounded like he was trying to shoulder the door open. Hannah let out a soft cry, and I clenched my fists, feeling helpless as I stood on the corner waiting for the Uber that seemed to take forever to arrive. Finally, the car pulled up, and I practically threw myself into the back seat. "Please, hurry," I told the driver. "My sister's in trouble." The driver, a middle-aged man with a thick accent, nodded and stepped on the gas. The car sped down the wet streets, weaving through late-night traffic as the neon lights of corner bodegas and streetlights blurred past. I kept my phone pressed to my ear, listening to Hannah's panicked breaths. "I'm almost there," I told her, even though I still had a good 10 minutes to go. "Just hang in there, all right?" The banging on her door had stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. But then I heard it, a soft click, like someone was trying to pick the lock. "Sam, I think he's trying to get in," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I could hear her moving, probably looking for something to defend herself with. "Is there a window you can climb out of?" I asked, my mind racing for any way to keep her safe. "No, they're all barred," she replied, her voice cracking. I could tell she was on the verge of tears. "Stay away from the door," I urged. "Find something heavy, just in case." As we sped through the streets of Queens, I could see the familiar landmarks flash by: the corner pizza shop, the bodega with its flickering neon sign, the old brick buildings that had seen better days. It felt like the longest ride of my life. Finally, we turned onto her street. I could see her building up ahead, the faint glow of the hallway lights visible through the grimy windows. I threw cash at the driver, not even waiting for him to fully stop before jumping out of the car. I sprinted to her door, my heart pounding in my ears. The rain had started again, a light drizzle that made the ground slick. I could hear shouting from inside her apartment, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. "Hannah!" I shouted, banging on her door. "It's me! Open up!" There was a moment of silence, and then I heard the chain lock slide back. The door opened just a crack, and Hannah's terrified face appeared. I pushed my way inside, slamming the door shut behind me. "Are you okay?" I asked, grabbing her shoulders. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "He's gone," she whispered. I think he heard you coming and ran." We locked the door and called 911 again. This time, 2 real officers arrived within minutes. They searched the area but found no sign of the man who had been trying to force his way inside. The officers told us that it wasn't the first time they'd heard about a fake cop trying to gain entry into people's homes. They suspected it was someone targeting women who lived alone, pretending to be a police officer to get them to open their doors. After that night, Hannah stayed with me for a while, too scared to be alone in her apartment. She eventually moved to a new place in a busier part of town, one with a doorman and better security. But even now, whenever there's a knock on the door, especially on a rainy night, I can see the fear in her eyes. And every time I hear about someone pretending to be an officer, I think back to that night in Queens, and I'm grateful I got there in time. A few years ago, my friend Megan moved into a small rental house in the Greenwood neighborhood of Seattle, a quiet area known for its old craftsman homes and tree-lined streets. It was a cozy little house, tucked away at the end of a narrow road with a backyard surrounded by tall evergreens. Megan had recently gone through a tough breakup and was looking forward to living alone for the first time. The house offered her a peaceful place to start over. It was early December, and Seattle had been hit with one of its typical winter storms. The rain had been relentless all day, turning the streets into rivers and drumming a constant rhythm against the windows. By the time evening rolled around, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees and sending branches tapping against the house. Megan tried to ignore it, lighting a few candles to make the place feel cozier as she settled in to watch a movie. She was curled up on the couch with a blanket, her cat, Oscar, purring softly beside her. The house felt unusually quiet, the sound of rain almost deafening against the roof. It was around 9:30 p.m. when she heard a knock at the door. It was loud and unexpected, startling her so much that she nearly dropped her mug of tea. Megan paused the movie and listened, thinking maybe it was the wind. But then, there it was again. 3 firm knocks, this time louder and more insistent. Her heart started to race. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially not on a night like this. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was strong enough to rattle the windows. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. But then she thought, what if it's an emergency? Maybe someone's car broke down, and they're looking for help. Megan walked to the door, but before opening it, she hesitated. She glanced out through the peephole. Standing on her porch was a man in a dark raincoat, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap and the heavy rain. He held up a badge to the peephole, though it was hard to see clearly through the water streaming down the glass. "Seattle Police, ma'am," he called out, his voice muffled by the sound of the storm. "Sorry to disturb you, but there's been a report of suspicious activity in the area. Just checking in to make sure everything's all right." Megan's instincts told her something was off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something about the way he stood there, too stiff, too rehearsed. Her thoughts raced. She lived alone and had never had any issues in the neighborhood before. Plus, it was strange for an officer to be making rounds in this kind of weather. "Can I see your badge again?" she asked through the door, trying to keep her voice steady. The man held it up closer this time, but the rain and the poor lighting made it nearly impossible to make out any details. "Ma'am, it's really coming down out here," he said, sounding slightly annoyed now. "If you could just open the door for a moment, I just have a few questions." Megan's anxiety spiked. Why would a police officer need her to open the door just to ask questions? Something didn't feel right. She remembered reading advice about not opening your door to strangers, even if they claimed to be law enforcement, and decided to trust her gut. "I'm sorry, but I can't open the door," she said firmly. "If you really are with the police, I can call the station to confirm." There was a long pause, the only sound the relentless drumming of the rain. Then the man's tone changed, harder, colder. "Listen, Ma'am, you need to open this door now. I'm not going to ask again." That was enough for Megan. She backed away from the door, her hands shaking. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her heart pounding in her chest. As she did, she heard the doorknob rattle. The man was trying to open it himself now, jiggling it violently. "911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher answered, and Megan quickly explained what was happening. "Stay on the line, ma'am," the dispatcher said. "We're sending officers to your location right now. Whatever you do, don't open the door." Megan's eyes were locked on the doorknob as it continued to shake. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. There was silence, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps retreating down her front steps. She didn't dare look out the window, too terrified of what she might see. Within minutes, she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. True police officers arrived shortly after, pounding on her door and identifying themselves properly. When she finally opened up, they searched the property but found no sign of the man. He had vanished into the storm. The officers took her statement and confirmed what she had suspected. The Seattle Police Department hadn't sent anyone to her house that night. Whoever had been at her door was not one of them. They praised her for not opening the door and for calling 911. Over the next few days, Megan was on edge, jumping at every sound. She installed extra locks and even set up a security camera on her porch. The police never caught the man, and they suspected he had been targeting homes in the area, pretending to be an officer to gain entry. The incident left Megan shaken, a harsh reminder that sometimes danger comes not as a shadowy intruder in the night, but as someone who appears trustworthy. To this day, every time she hears a knock on the door, especially on a rainy night, her heart skips a beat. It was a rainy, humid night in Savannah, Georgia, the kind where the air feels thick and the heavy scent of wet moss and magnolia trees lingers everywhere. The storm had rolled in unexpectedly, drenching the cobblestone streets and sending tourists scrambling to find cover. On the outskirts of the historic district, in a quiet residential neighborhood filled with old Victorian homes, Mr. and Mrs. Wilcox were settling in for the night. The Wilcoxes were in their 70s, a sweet couple who had lived in their house on Abercorn Street for nearly 40 years. Their home was the quintessential Southern dream: white columns, a wraparound porch, and a yard shaded by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. But on this stormy night it felt isolated, with the rain pounding on the roof and the wind rattling the shutters. Mrs. Wilcox was in the living room, knitting by the soft glow of a table lamp, while her husband sat in his favorite armchair reading the local newspaper. The storm had knocked out their cable earlier, leaving the house eerily quiet except for the sound of the rain and the occasional clap of thunder. It was nearing midnight when they heard a loud, insistent knock at the front door. Mr. Wilcox looked up from his paper, frowning. At this hour, they rarely got visitors, especially in weather like this. "Who could that be?" Mrs. Wilcox asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Maybe it's one of the neighbors," he replied, though he didn't sound convinced. Savannah was known for its friendly neighbors, but not many would venture out in a storm like this. The knocking came again, more forceful this time. Mr. Wilcox slowly got up from his chair, grabbing his cane for support. As he shuffled to the door, Mrs. Wilcox trailed behind him, her knitting needles still in hand. "Who is it?" Mr. Wilcox called out, his voice steady but wary. "Savannah Police Department, sir," a voice responded. It was deep and authoritative, with a slight southern drawl. "We need to speak with you about a reported break-in down the street." Mr. Wilcox hesitated. They hadn't heard any commotion or seen any flashing lights, which would have been noticeable even through the heavy rain. Still, he unlocked the door, leaving the chain on, and cracked it open just enough to peer out. Standing on the porch was a man in what appeared to be a dark police raincoat, the kind you'd expect an officer to wear on a night like this. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his rain-soaked cap, and the porch light flickered, casting his features in shadow. He held up what looked like a badge, but with the dim light and the rain streaming down, it was hard to see clearly. "There's been a break-in reported 2 blocks over," the man said. "We're checking on all the houses in the area to make sure everyone's safe. Mind if I come in for a moment to ask you a few questions?" Mrs. Wilcox's grip tightened on her knitting needles. Something about this didn't feel right. It was late, the storm was raging, and why would the police need to come into their home just to ask questions? Mr. Wilcox, ever the southern gentleman, was about to undo the chain when Mrs. Wilcox put a hand on his arm. "Wait," she said softly. Turning back toward the door, she spoke through the gap. "Do you have any identification, officer?" There was a pause. The man shifted, and for a moment, his friendly demeanor seemed to slip. "I've already shown you my badge, ma'am," he said, his tone growing more impatient. "It's pouring out here. I just need to come inside for a minute." Mr. Wilcox felt his wife's hand tighten on his arm. Something in the man's tone sent a chill down her spine. "Hold on," she said, her voice firm despite her growing fear. "We're going to call the Savannah Police Department to confirm." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain and the wind whipping through the trees. Then the man's demeanor changed completely. He slammed his hand against the door, rattling it on its hinges. "Open the door!" he shouted, the polite tone gone, replaced with a harsh, angry growl. "You have no idea what you're doing." Mrs. Wilcox gasped, and Mr. Wilcox pushed his weight against the door to keep it closed. The old couple was no match for the force on the other side, but they held on with everything they had. Mrs. Wilcox quickly grabbed the cordless phone from the nearby table and dialed 911, her hands trembling. "911, what's your emergency?" the operator answered, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. "There's a man at our door pretending to be the police," Mrs. Wilcox said, her voice barely steady. "He's trying to force his way in." "Stay on the line, ma'am," the operator said calmly. "Officers are on their way. Whatever you do not open the door." The pounding on the door grew more violent, the stranger shouting obscenities now. "You think they're going to get here in time, old man? Open the damn door!" Mr. Wilcox, despite his age and frail health, pressed against the door with all his might, his face pale but resolute. Mrs. Wilcox, her heart racing, kept the phone pressed to her ear as the operator assured her that real police were just minutes away. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. For a moment, everything was silent except for the storm raging outside. Then they heard footsteps on the porch, followed by the sound of someone running away. "Ma'am, are you still there?" the 911 operator asked. "Yes," Mrs. Wilcox replied, her voice shaky. "I think he's gone." "Stay where you are. The officers are almost there." True to her word, within minutes, 2 police cars pulled up in front of the house, their lights flashing, illuminating the rain-soaked street. Real officers emerged, guns drawn, and quickly checked the perimeter of the property, but the man was long gone. The officers came to the door, and this time, after verifying their identity through the window, the Wilcoxes let them in. They were kind and professional, taking statements from the shaken couple and searching the area for any sign of the intruder. "It's not the first report we've had like this recently," one of the officers explained, his face grim. "Someone's been going around pretending to be law enforcement, targeting elderly residents. He probably hoped you'd let your guard down." As the officers left, they promised to increase patrols in the area, but it was little comfort to the Wilcoxes. They'd always thought of their home as a safe haven, a place where they could grow old together in peace. But after that night, They added extra locks to every door and installed security cameras around the property. From that day on, whenever there was a knock at the door, especially on a rainy night, Mrs. Wilcox's heart would race, and Mr. Wilcox would reach for the cane he'd used to brace the door that night. They'd learned a hard lesson. Sometimes, the greatest threat isn't the storm outside, but the one that comes knocking, pretending to be someone you should trust.